the fact that South Africa is unique, and in that if you look at the owner support area, it's probably the only area, probably globally, we have 3 key institutions that are focused on livestock health and livestock productivity in particular, being the owner support veterinary research facility, the owner support biological products company, and the University of Pretoria Faculty of Veterinary Sciences, all of them within a 1 kilometer radius of one another, and with ample space that provides for opportunities for further investments in the animal health industry, which then could actually drive economic development for South Africa. This provides an opportunity for all of us to work with each other, both the public sector and the private sector, towards driving livestock development and livestock production and productivity in the country. And we believe that it's through these types of partnerships and investments that we could change the landscape of South Africa, both in the context of the infrastructure, in the context of the skills development that actually will be coming through there, but also with the products that will be coming out of these particular industries, if we could all partner with one another and drive the economy in that particular space. Let me stop there. I could engage a bit further. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much. Maybe if we can then move on to Dr. Helke Martiens, who's the Executive Director of the Creating Hope Foundation.
Good afternoon, everyone. I believe agriculture is at a serious crossroad in South Africa. Today we have immense food and nutrition security issues. Unemployment skyrocket due to the pandemic, and rural communities and many households are presently at a place where hunger and poverty are dark realities. We can run out of many things in the world, but if we run out of food and water, we are in real trouble. Nobody ever believed that it's possible that the whole world can come to a standstill, and yet it happened this year. The pandemic made it clear that we are not safe as though we thought we were. We have learned from 2020, and we must use this reality of the pandemic as a wake-up call to also look at our agriculture and food security situation. It is expected that up to 7 million people could lose their jobs in this year in South Africa. Furthermore, many people have become desperate for food, and the queues of people waiting for food parcels made international headlines. We have to realize that we have to look at the 3 levels of food security in South Africa, namely household, community, and national. And we also have to realize that each level is being serviced by a specific type of producer, and each is vitally important to take South Africa forward. We need households to start producing in their backyards. We need a workable approach to develop small-scale farmers, and we have to make our commercial farming sector stronger. Furthermore, we have to realize that we have to find a vision for South Africa for agriculture, and then we have to work together to make this vision a reality. Currently, we face many challenges. With these challenges in mind, we at Creating Hope Africa have developed a model to help farmers in South Africa. Our pilot program is currently in the Bergrivier Municipality in the Western Cape. Working on this model, we realized that we have to bring much more than just farmers to the table. Research shows we need bankers, insurance companies, and retailers to help small-scale farmers enter the market as self-sustainable and financially viable producers. Yet currently, the risk is too big for many financial institutions and retailers to bring themselves to back up small-scale farmers. We also need investors and offtake agreements, not only for small-scale farmers, but also for commercial farmers, so that we can earn GDP for our country. We need to realize that we have to commercialize the whole food system. We cannot focus on one process and think that we will have a successful and vibrant agriculture system. To find out such a model, we've talked to one of the biggest commercial banks in South Africa. They agreed to match fund our projects. Business plans must be underwritten through the banking process so that risk is minimized. Our model is working on a pay-it-forward concept, meaning that our assets are being doubled. We further raise money from sound offtake agreements and markets. With all these in place, the government does not need to keep funding to roll out in all the provinces as the model will become self-sustainable.
All right, thank you very much, Dr. Hilke Martiens. Omri van Zyl is the Executive Director of Agri-SA. He's also part of the panelists. Maybe, Omri, if you can take it from there and give us your thoughts.
Yeah, thank you very much. Thank you, Minister. Can you all hear me?
Oh, we can. Well, I can hear you.
Okay, wonderful. Hello, everybody. It's nice to form part of this panel. It seems like yesterday that we were on the same panel, Minister. It looks like we're paddling ahead. But I think from our side, and the Minister, I think, summarized a lot of the bigger issues. From an infrastructure development side, we will not grow or fire up our economy without it. I mean, that is the reality. Practically, things like dam wall restoration in the Orange River, bulk water infrastructure, irrigation scheme updates, that type of things will definitely fire up more of the agriculture industry. Now, in terms of the dream is that we create a type of a Singapore for Africa. We have the financial services, we have the human capital, we have the research institutions, we have some of the infrastructure. The ports obviously needs to be updated, and upgraded properly. But the only way that we see this is through private participation and public-private partnerships. Now, what does that physically mean? It means that we need to think out of the box in terms of tax incentives for agricultural development, for farmers, for agribusinesses that are already operating in the value chain. Most of it can be done tomorrow if the right incentives are there. The other big issue that's an elephant in the room always is the purpose of the land bank and what the land bank does, where it's been confusing its developmental strategy with its commercial strategy. And maybe it's a good idea for the land bank to sell off some of its assets to make sure that it gets more money into the developmental aspect of its business. What we need is something like an agriculture credit board that creates a softer loan funding for commercial agriculture. On top of that, tax incentives. If we do just those two things, if we just do those two things, inclusive growth will exponentially happen, and the private sector will make it happen itself. And it's something that has worked in the past, and it's something that we believe can work again. Then we need to be smarter about what we do around our competitiveness in terms of, let's say, one of the speakers mentioned livestock. And we don't have a livestock traceability system in South Africa. Botswana has one, Namibia has one. They export meat to the EU, we don't. Things like that will create the opportunity for thousands and thousands of smallholder farmers to actually better their genetics and get access to international markets. And some of it is already happening in the Eastern Cape. So if you ask me, what is the road ahead? I mean, our economy is has contracted dramatically. We're going to have to be smart about the investments we make in the economy. Agriculture, we believe, is one of the best investments because of the capacity we do have and the potential we have. I mean, we have millions of hectares that are still to be cultivated and to be worked on, that we can use in a smart way to grow the economy, ensure rural food security, and get more income into the system. But I think the reset button on the world has been pushed. It is not business as usual. If we think that the future is going to look like the past, that we are definitely going to make a big mistake. My prediction is the guys that are going to survive in the world will be the guys that will draw the investors into their economies. And how do you do that? You create policy certainty, you create incentives, you create investor-friendly environments, and a lot of that we already have. Some of it we will need to develop, because capital is shy like a kudu. Capital doesn't care, whether it invests in Australia or in Chile or in South Africa or in the UK. But I do believe we are extremely well positioned as South Africa and our export markets into Africa to fire up our economy and to become that hub for research and development, for technology transfer, for biotech, for nanotech, for smallholder programs that are commercially viable. But for all of that, we need capital. We need to draw in capital, and we need to draw in capital that we can make cheaper. If we can do that, the rest of the things will happen. We will make sure of it in the private sector. Thank you. We can't hear you. I think you're muted.
Now you can hear me. Thank you very much, Omri, Executive Director at Agri-SA. Dr. Vuyo Mahlati, if you can give us your remarks.
Thank you so much, and good afternoon to the Minister. Thanks for that introduction, and to the fellow panelists. I think I'm just going to raise a few issues as part of the introductory remarks. The first one is that if we are to talk about agricultural infrastructure now, the critical issue is to be intentional, is to be more structured and more strategic. Because what we have seen now are pockets of excellence. I mean, what's happening in the Western Cape, and particularly in the horticulture industry, has demonstrated to us that if you get the right parts right, from infrastructure to logistics, all the way up in terms of the chain, you can actually manage to move from, primary production and be able to process and export and be a global player. Now, the critical thing is, how do we learn from that and ensure that we take that to the different other subsectors or commodities? Now, my view is that in being intentional, structured, and strategic, one of the things we have to do is to be focused on our enabling infrastructure. In the report of the panel on land, we talk about land, water, energy nexus. And that's a very critical thing. But now I am adding the fourth one into that nexus, and that is broadband. Because if we don't make sure that the basic infrastructure that we have can carry any form and type of productivity and stimulate competitiveness, irrespective of which part of the world you are in this country, rural or urban, or the most rural area that you can find, at least you get the basics. And linked to that is making sure that you even have your public-private partnerships and financing models that are suitable for the different type of infrastructure. Because when we talk about infrastructure finance, we tend to focus on one part and not address the diversity of the areas and the circumstances that we find ourselves in our country. So that critical issue of that nexus, for me, is the basis of ensuring. And for instance, you find places like the Eastern Cape with so much grazing land, but so much erosion as well, with, quite a number of farmers in mixed farming. And in a sense, if we deal with this basic infrastructure, we would be able to ensure that we don't face such problems. We are more sustainable. When we're talking about sustainable infrastructure, it is about also giving us the sustainable result. The part linked to that is the critical issue of understanding that we don't have time. Yes, we have a serious problem in our country of dualism, but we're also having a more serious problem at a global level in terms of food systems and the conversations that are taking place right now. And if we are not pushing competitiveness, for instance, now there's discussions at a UN World Food level on food systems and push for replacing animal protein, and also push in terms of involving more corporate retailers in the food systems and the farmers at a different level. And these are the conversations that we're having at a global level, and they're actually creating serious threats, particularly for those who are starting from scratch. So we're needing to be very focused, strategic, and intentional in making sure that there is a clear program, not a hit and miss. We're tired of project-focused approach to infrastructure development, because it actually, as soon as you stop funding that project, it dies. So we need a more coordinated approach. And lastly, what is critical when we're talking about public-private partnerships, including the issues of access of roads in rural areas, it's important to appreciate that that includes local communities, local farmers. We've got great examples in infrastructure development, road infrastructure, that we have seen in Asia, for instance, where they're part and parcel of even the maintenance, so that there is not reliance on the states. So the needs, when we're looking at incentive models and structurally, we need to make sure that the local municipalities for local production are hooked on this and also have the right capacities to drive it at the right level. Thank you.
Unmuted.
Yeah, I'm saying Wandile Shobo, it's over to you. And Wandile Shobo is Chief Economist of the Agricultural Business Chamber Agribiz. Can you hear me, Wandile Shobo?
Yeah, I've now gotten, I was just unmuting. Thank you, Pumelelo, and good afternoon. I'm going to build on some of the points that Dr. Mahlati has just highlighted, because there is now a growing consensus among South Africa's agricultural economists that the next frontier for growth in South Africa's agricultural sector will really be through the expansion of production, mainly in the former homelands provinces. That is your KZN, Eastern Cape, and Limpopo. And I think the government land and some of the underperforming land reform funds are also amongst the additional avenues for this expansion in output, which we are all thinking about. Now, the Eastern Cape and Limpopo have for some time been amongst the provinces with least contribution to the nation's agricultural fortunes, respectively accounting for roughly 6% and 7% on that GDP. And to the point again that Dr. Mahlati was making, that the Western Cape, Free State, and Mpumalanga, to name a few, they contribute largely to the South African agricultural GDP because of all of those infrastructure developments, all ranging between 22% and 9%, their individual contribution to the GDP of agriculture. Now, a crucial step for South Africa is to understand why the agricultural development has lagged in the past 2 decades in those provinces, which is your Eastern Cape and the other former homelands provinces, while the commercial agriculture generally in other provinces has actually doubled their output. And in our view, there are several reasons that explain this disparity in fortunes. And the most notable ones being the lack of investments in agriculture and the theme of today, which is particularly on the infrastructure. It is lacking in those provinces. Now, on the investments point, poor land governance, particularly the lack of secure tenure, both in the former homelands and in some land reform farms owned by government, have been the key impediment which disincentivizes on-farm investments. And on the infrastructure point, we think that the lack of basic infrastructure, such as your basic roads, network, railway lines, silos, irrigation system, water, electricity, has contributed to low agricultural productivity and poor linkages to markets, particularly for smallholder farmers. Now, in an era of consolidation and fiscal prudence, the tightness of very scarce government resources relates to the ever-growing challenges on how to close the infrastructure gaps becomes a key challenge. And on agriculture, unlike on the mining space where the private sector generally leads the way and paves the way in the efforts of building public infrastructure, agriculture, particularly smallholder farming, heavily relies on state land and government-supported initiative in developing the required public infrastructure that supports production and market access. Now, with government resources stretched, the scope for infrastructure development around areas such as irrigation systems, silos, electricity generation, pack houses for agriculture to thrive can be entirely led by private sector. And I think Omri also alluded to a certain extent to this point. But I think in other essential infrastructures such as roads, your rail, your dams, the government would ideally take a lead there. But I think then again, there is also a room for public-private partnership approach there, specifically for major agribusinesses that are aiming to expand their footprint in the new agricultural growth frontiers, which is your Eastern Cape, KZN, and Limpopo, which is where we still have a potential. The approach for this, however, will need to be a bottom-up one this time around, where agribusinesses will need to identify the binding constraints to development in these specific areas of their interest. And I think then the co-financing infrastructure development aimed at addressing these concerns with government will need to be hand in hand at this time around. This means the identification of constraints, design of problem, as well as project management and execution would involve both parties. Agribusinesses on their end, they need to take a long-term view at this time around by providing expertise, finance to help address the bottlenecks to developments that will assist in growing the agricultural sector. Over time, this should increase their returns as agricultural production take place. And I think the spin-offs from infrastructure development and improved land governance, that's providing a tradable long-term leases and title deeds in some areas, would result not only on increased agricultural productivity, but I think it would also solve the challenge of today, which is this higher unemployment and agriculture being seen as one of the sectors that can assist on that. Now, besides, as I'm closing, besides the issues impacting the less developed parts of agriculture, on a commercial agriculture is also hampered by some logistical infrastructure constraints. Bottlenecks at the major ports of South Africa are increasingly becoming an area of concern. And I think this is also another area that needs to be looked at because as we look at it, South Africa's agricultural sector is now export orientated. And if we are looking at putting infrastructure in less developed areas with the goal of increasing output and also creating employment, that means that we will need a similar energy on the areas where we'll be able to export these products. And this is yet again another area where I think greater collaboration between private sector and government and local government authorities would be beneficial for actually pushing progress in South Africa's agriculture. Now, in the nutshell, what I'm saying is that agriculture has a potential to create a job in South Africa and also contribute on economic growth in the post-COVID phase. But I think all of this hinges in part on the success of the infrastructure developments, which is why I think the discussions that we are having today is so important. I will stop there, Pumelele. Thank you. I think you are still on mute, Pumelele.
Yeah, thank you very much. Because I keep on coming back, I keep on forgetting the unmute button. I just need to remind myself of that. It seems like the one question that keeps on coming up, or the one is the issue of transformation and how you then work them. It came up a few times. The KwaZulu-Natal, the former homelands, the Eastern Cape, and Limpopo, and one day where they offered a few solutions. Maybe if you can try to answer to that, there, Minister Togo Titiza, on issues of the former homelands.
Thank you very much, Pumelele. I agree entirely with the issues that have been raised by Wandile, Omri, as well as Vuyo, on how we can maximize our support, working together with the private sector in revitalizing some of these areas. I must say that there have been organizations in the past who have tried to actually intervene, such as Amadlelo and others. The question we need to ask, what went wrong, or what has been the problem in financing some of these projects? Is it the way they are prepared? Is it that maybe there are no prospects for seeing returns on it from the financing point of view? And these are the issues, in my view, that we need to reflect on. What is important about this process, and I think the sixth administration led by President Ramaphosa, is how do we mobilize our resources as government, private sector, and communities in the success of our economy as a country, and also in the success of our development. So the issues of the homeland areas, issues of land governance, as well as it has been raised, are matters that we are actually dealing with as government, particularly on those areas where government has land parcels through the long-term lease that can actually be tradable for financing purposes. I'll stop there for now.
All right, thank you very much. We will be taking some questions from the chat room there as well. I believe we have a question from Mayana Matodzi. We will be getting to that question in a bit. And there also has been a reach out from the government for a few projects that we're going to possibly watch. One of the projects, if we do have time. It is a video that we possibly are going to get to. Projects reaching out, and they say that a lot of them are not financially ready. A lot of the projects that they have received. Maybe this could be for anybody. Why do you think that a lot of the upcoming small-scale farmers do the work, but you find that even after the assistance, after entering a sort of like projects that are going to try and help them with assistance, you find that in the end, they're still not financially ready, they're not financially sustainable? Maybe one day, let's show if you can help there.
Yeah, thanks, Pumelelo. I think a greater part, at least in my judgment, lies on some of these things that I was emphasizing on. Because it's one thing going with the support on supporting someone on this particular season, but it's one thing improving the conditions of that area around so that it is friendlier for more investments, it is friendlier for people to be able to thrive. Because if you ask the specific questions on those smallholder farmers and saying, why were you unable in the next season to go forward? They will mention things that the harvest came in, I couldn't get the market linkages. And all of those things are talking back to your road networks. So I think for me, if in this infrastructure discussion we are having now, we can be able to come up with a viable financing solutions, which will be able to address the issues that are binding constraints on the infrastructure. Then the second layer then of private sector and everybody being able to come on their entrepreneurial spirit will be able to take off there. But until infrastructure is resolved, we will keep on going back to some of those smallholder farmers and not really being able to see them being sustainable over the long run.
All right. There is a question from Mitesh Chotu, and Mitesh says, even though many areas have been solved for years now, where do we stand as South Africa on our adoption? And Mitesh also speaks about issues of alternative blended financing. Maybe anyone who can take that?
Perhaps if I could just touch on a little bit on some of the question that was raised earlier that Wandile has also responded to. I think it should be taken into notice quite significantly the different approach that is now being brought together by this particular government, which is the district development model, which clearly and appropriately recognized the need for an integrated approach towards bringing solutions for smallholder farmers, particularly for those in previously underserviced rural areas, to bring all the different types of services that actually need to really essentially coalesce or converge, essentially almost all at the same time, in order to enable the actual production and productivity to happen for those particular smallholder farmers in those particular areas, but also for the markets or market infrastructure that also need to be happening besides just the road infrastructure. Now, I talked earlier about the investments into vaccine facility, but also the investments into laboratory infrastructure, because it is these particular laboratories that actually certify the condition of your agriculture produce, the standards of your agriculture produce, for you to be able to meet the export standards and your market access requirements out there, in order for you to be able to generate the kind of profits or revenue that you actually need to have in your agriculture enterprises. So if you bring all of these as a totality rather than in piecemeal, you would be able to address quite a number of these particular constraints. However, I think the point that Dr. Mahlati raised earlier is very, very important because she said one of the key things that we need to be very resolute and be very clear and purposeful about is that we need to be targeted in our approach to ensuring that the previously underserviced, particularly small rural agricultural enterprises, that we actually, in a way, handhold them to be able to get their products to market, but also to enable them to have their products to meet the market standards that are required both in the domestic market, but also in the export market. If we are going to actually grow our agriculture and our economy in a much more sustainable manner, we actually do need to ensure that we have the broad diversity of the different types of producers that we have in the country, and that our agriculture economy and agriculture infrastructure is inclusive of all the participants, and that it should not actually create bottlenecks for others, but actually should be encouraging towards the participation of a whole range of participants so that they could all get their products to the market. Now, the question that you now raised around adoption, yes, there's a range of technologies that people could adopt. There's a range of insights or knowledge that actually individuals or enterprises need to adopt. These need to be fit for purpose. However, we need to also understand the basis upon which some of the technology transfers are not happening properly, and we need to unlock those particular areas. One of the challenges that we now are beginning to find is the fact that in this age of COVID-19, where we're now meeting through digital infrastructure, do we have the same kind of digital infrastructure to enable market access in rural areas such as Limpopo, Eastern Cape, Northwest, and so on? How do we facilitate that besides just the land and water and energy in a manner that actually is going to enable those particular participants to be active participants and not just simply people that are depending or asking for government to give them handouts? My understanding in our history in working with smallholder farmers is that they're not asking for handouts. They're simply asking for guidance on how to get their work done and to become very productive in the economy. Thank you.
I think, Malele, you raised another point from one of the participants relating to the financing.
Yes, Minister.
If I were to just come in, one of those issues Omri touched, that maybe we need to revisit the mandate of the Land Bank. While it retains its developmental objective, find a space of affordable financing such as the old Agricultural Credit Board, which really had affordable interest rate, though it was a credit facility, but it actually understood that those who are still at the entry level will require more support, not just financing, but also other non-finance support. I also think the proposal on blended finance is important, and not only linked to the state working with the land bank alone, but the state working with other agricultural, with other financing institutions. Currently, as the Department of Land Affairs and Agriculture, we've actually been working with ABSA to explore the possibility of having a blended finance instrument so that we can work with a number of financing players so that we don't have a one-size-fits-all of the financing arrangement for our producers, because it varies from the size of the producers as well as the size of the enterprise and the cycles around which these participate. Issue also that was raised by Hilke is very important, to actually look at how we also develop policies and instruments for supporting your household producers who are very critical in terms of household food security, but not only ending there, how they graduate to become sustainable and commercially viable. Thank you very much.
Thank you for that. There's another question, but there's a lot of feedback that we are getting from one of the microphones. I'm not sure.
I think it's mine.
Yeah. All right, great. Yeah, it's gone now. Minister, there's another question for you. This one is coming from Fanyana Matoti, who is asking, how do we get information on government agriculture projects that focus on women, youth, and military veterans that need funding?
Thank you very much, Spumelele, and for the person who's raised the question. Indeed, our government officials are the source of information, but we understand that there are weaknesses that have been highlighted, not just the person who asked the question now, but also other people in the past who have said government communication system is not actually adequate or easily available for the general public to know where they need to go for what type of support at any given time. And that's one area that we are actually improving. But what is important is also how do we as government work with our partners in the sector so that that information is not only available from government offices, but can be available from our farmers organization and other agribusiness entities, so that people, when they want to access that information, are not only channeled at one point of communication. Thank you very much.
All right. I believe we do have SIDSSA from the Technical Working Group to give us some of their highlight opportunities and systematic issues that they had as a working group.
Thank you, Pumelele. Honorable Minister and panelists, thanks for the opportunity. So I'm going to pretty much give you an indication of the experiences that we had as a technical working group that looked at the project submitted for this SIDS, for SIDS 2020. And most of the issues that have been raised by panelists are actually the experiences that we got. So if you wish, all of the projects, about 54 projects that we received as a technical working group, carried with it particular challenges, most of which have been raised by the panelists here today. So when we, at the end of it all, when we look at what perhaps affected the possibility for most projects coming out through to the SIDS at bankable level, there are a number of systemic issues that we can talk about, but it starts with what I think Dr. Mahlati referred to as a directed approach. So to the effect that the country needs to have a proper and well-researched master plan. That plan will dictate and direct where particular infrastructural development should take place. So when we look at what we received, it was not necessarily talking to any specific priorities that have been set up from a government and private sector-led master plan. Additionally, we also realized that most of these projects did not include a multi-sectoral approach to infrastructure development. What Dr. Mohair said in relation to the district development model, very little of the projects that we saw had a multi-governmental involvement in them. What we saw were projects that were largely driven by individual entities or business people with a particular interest that is largely personal or as it related to those particular businesses in terms of the ownership of those businesses, but not projects that would be catalytic in nature in order to do what the president referred to, act as a flywheel of the economy. So to the extent that many of these projects came to us and we evaluated them, we realized that a big part of the challenge, which is something that panelists have also raised, relate to project preparation. So the ability to put together a project that is bankable for financiers. And the minister has also related to that when she spoke about the need to look at the full value chain of support, not just the financing support, but also ensuring that these projects are, or rather the promoters of the projects are assisted to provide well-researched projects that can stand the test in terms of the due diligence of financiers. So which means that the entities need to be supported right from the preparation of business plans, even beyond the institution of these projects in terms of post-project support. So we also realize that in many instances, the idea of a project being self-funding, or if it's not self-funding, at least some form of cost recovery, or as others would call it, user pay principles, that these projects needed to have something of that nature in order to ensure their sustainability. Beyond just sustainability in terms of, for example, environmentally sustainable projects, which is also a key aspect that we found wanting in most of the projects that we evaluated. And I think both the doctors as well as Wandile also raised this particular aspect, that in instances where you have particular projects, they have to fit in within the value chain of that industry within agriculture, to the extent that they are also supported in the form of regulatory framework. So if you look at issues such as tariffs and subsidies, that needs to be looked at to support the sustainability of operations and businesses of this nature. It is something that we also found as we looked at these projects. The video that Pumelelo spoke about, which hopefully we'll get an opportunity to see, relates to the Talipia incubator project in Beshe. And when you look at that, it looks at what typically we think as the technical working group are the kinds of projects that would create sufficient catalytic roles in as far as ensuring that agriculture in general benefits, not just one or two promoters of particular projects. So, Pumelelo, I'll pause here, but just to confirm that all of the issues that were raised by panelists, we encountered them in practice as we went through projects that were considered for this SIDS 2020. Thanks, Pumelelo.
All right, sure. Yeah, Incubator, thanks very much. I believe that video is ready. If we could possibly look at that particular video of the projects that were successful. All right, as it loads, this is one of the videos. Hopefully we do get a chance to see it. It's loading and it's freezing at the moment. Hopefully in good time we'll get to see it properly.
It appears not to have volume, Pumelelo.
Yeah, it's Nonzuzo and Nombulelo, they're uploading it. So can you just check there, Nonzuzo and Nombulelo, what the issue is with the sound over there? It's also freezing. I think it's because it hasn't loaded properly. All right, I think we need to carry on with the discussion as it loads, and hopefully it will continue to load. We did hear from Silver Soundy there that a lot of projects that they found that they entered for this particular project that they have, it did not seem to be sustainable for a very long time. Maybe it also might remove the video because I think it sort of wants to come in and it's disturbing a little bit.
Simpulela, can I come in here?
Yeah, go in, Omri.
Should we wait for the video to be removed, or what do you think?
I think just go ahead, continue speaking, because at least we can see you and we can hear you.
We've been looking at development projects over the past 5-6 years, and also working with guys like the IDC and a variety of other role players. Now, one of the biggest challenges is to find bankable projects that are actually bankable. Now, the success rate for bankability is about 5 or 6% of the total amount of projects that we've reviewed. Now, in order for that to succeed, or the most successful projects are definitely projects between private sector farmers, agribusinesses, and development farmers, developing farmers. So your ratio of success and bankability goes up quite significantly. So Amotlelo is a very good example of that. So we actually
Yeah, you've disappeared, you've frozen there, Omri. Omri was saying that bankability is about 5 to 6%. You did freeze there a little bit. Maybe if you can pick up on your point, you're telling us about why bankability is 5 to 6%.
So if we look at the success ratio of a private sector entity plus a development entity, it's a lot higher than a greenfields project that gets funded. So there are, like Amatlelo, there are big projects that are working. So if we can get a development finance instrument like the Agriculture Credit Board or what, remember the land bank sits on what, 45 billion rands of loans and assets. I don't know how many of that is bad debts and all of that stuff, but it's quite a significant amount of money. And the commercial banks will take a lot of the good assets off. If we can do that, and I can tell you now, if we go to Amatlelo or whoever else in the agriculture sector and give them a 6% interest rate loan on the premise that they do development work, it will spread like wildfire, and this is the quickest way. We can have master plans, and we are busy with a master plan, and there's such a lot of plans, but if we really want to get traction, it lies in the economics of agriculture. And if we can get that right, if we can get that development finance institution right with preferential loans for inclusive growth and development and Black economic empowerment, I'm telling you now, it will happen quicker than we can imagine.
There is a question from Theo Boshoff, who seems to think that there is cooperation between government and the private sector. So the question reads, this is for Minister Toditiza, and I'll also open it up to the floor to see, to the panelists, to see who else takes it after the minister. It reads, many investment opportunities have been hampered by a lack of coordination between private sector and the state, as well as between different spheres of government. How can we streamline processes to expedite these investments? Minister, starting with you, and then whoever else wants to take that, because it seems like Theo Boshoff believes the private sector and government are not streamlined their approaches in this.
Well, thank you very much. I agree that one of the issues, before you even go to the private sector, it's how, as government ourselves, with the different spheres, are actually aligned in the way in which we actually deal with issues of investment. So part of the district development model seeks to address precisely that. And secondly, the alignment between government and the private sector. It's correct that we need to actually align ourselves. And I think the SIDS process, which we're in now, it's one of such first examples that shows how we can collaboratively work together with the private sector as government in order to facilitate better support to individuals and industries, and how we can actually fast track investment in the areas of development. I just want to touch also to what Omri had said. I agree. Without affordable finance, it's very difficult to actually attract many investors in the agricultural sector. And it actually acts as a disincentive. Issues that as a country we need to also address, in my view. Thank you very much.
All right.
Thanks. Can I just add, because I'm gonna come off as well.
All right, Dr. Makhasi, you can go ahead.
Yeah, I just think looking at the SIDS feedback and what the panelists said, we urgently need a non-finance support program that is aligned to the preparation process. Because one of the things we're finding...
All right, Dr. Makhasi, you are becoming increasingly difficult to hear. Sorry to cut you off there, Dr. Makhasi. You're becoming increasingly to hear because, again, there's a microphone that's giving us feedback again. Last time it was on his microphone. I'm not sure if it's still that one or if it's another microphone.
I'm muted.
You're muted. All right, it could be. Maybe if we can all mute our microphones, and then maybe just... Okay, let's all mute and then just leave Dr. Makhasi on. You can go ahead, Dr. Makhasi.
Yes, I'm saying non-financial support, the big issue. What we have found at AFASA is that the bigger issue is the right people applying for the right projects. So from the beginning, the selection, the wrong people are applying for wrong things. And it becomes important in the non-finance that assists with the selection and assisting the people at the level where they are. Otherwise, everybody, when they hear there's money, pocket of money somewhere, applies. And you find that 3/4 of those don't really qualify. So we can deal with this if we have a very clear pre-feasibility, pre-preparatory program that supports, which is non-financial. And if we don't do that, we'll be complaining all the time.
All right. Thanks, Dr. Mahlati. Does anyone want to speak to that? And those are the points.
Yes. Pumelela Wandile at this side. I don't know if you can hear me.
We can hear you loud and clear, Wandile.
Thank you so much. Pumelela, I just want to add to the views that have been put up on the, just on 2 points. Firstly, the streamlining issue of government activities and the private sector activity. And on a second point I will make contribution on is on this funding story. Now, let's start on the streamlining. My view is that, and I mean, this is the point where I would slightly differ, for example, with Omri to a certain extent, on these master plans. I think these master plans at the conceptual level, to the idea that they are bringing the private sector and government and other stakeholders in the industries, they try to work straight onto that, where they're identifying the common opportunities that everyone will see, and also that will identify some of the other areas that there could be areas of implementation, of partnership. Now, as to whether then at the implementation that will be followed or not, we yet to see that. But I do think that at the streamlining, they have a value on there. And I would think that the department has to be even more open on listening to what the private sector and other industry groups have to offer onto that, on finding the common ground. And now on the second point where I want to make a contribution on is on the funding stuff. Now, in the literature work, for example, both with the agriculture economists, Professor Johan Kerstin, and also with the work of the panel with Dr. Mahlati, we've proposed there what was called a land reform fund, which was the fund that we're saying for stimulating investments and driving production and all of these nice things we want to see on agriculture. It could draw capital from private sector. It could draw capital from some of the investors. It could also assist government on taking all of the agricultural related money that is in different portfolios and have them in one pot. And that one pot is one that could facilitate to a certain extent all of these development aspirations that we are currently having. And I think that those are some of the ideas that could actually be revisited to see if they could bear any fruit to some of this infrastructure work that we are talking about today, particularly on a finance side and also on the streamlining side of the ideas. That master plan, I think it plays part to that extent. Thank you.
There's also a question. We did touch briefly on roads infrastructure earlier on, and Omri did touch on a lack of exports in some industries to the EU, which he made examples with Namibia and Botswana, which have that. We have a question from Nick Foshier, and Nick says, poor roads led to milk collection routes closed and exiting dairy farmers, insufficient numbers of vets and lack of parlour certification by local municipalities are partly responsible for no EU exports for 13 years. And the main message there, he says, is infrastructure and services. I suppose these are some of the issues, but maybe if anyone wants to answer to that, he raises this as especially the lack of roads as why certain projects fail and certain situations are as terrible as they are in his view.
Perhaps if I could make 1 or 2 comments on that, and because it links quite well with what Omri had said. I think if we take the example of the cotton industry, 10 years ago, the cotton industry was as good as dead. Had it not been for putting together a proper master plan for the cotton industry with specific interventions. And these various interventions go all the way from primary production, which is the agronomic side of agriculture production, to presenting to the farmers and actually enabling the technology transfer through new cultivars that the farmers could use for them to be competitive and to have the kind of yields that they need of pest-resistant cotton cultivars, but also to the harvesting and processing of some of these particular cultivars. There were investments that were then made, mostly facilitated through government, together in partnership with the cotton industry, that resulted in the setting up of cotton gins to process the cotton from the farms into the ginneries, and since then there's been further investments in this particular space towards further processing of this particular cotton into fiber and so on. But what we now need, and what is since become very clear, is that the cotton industry, as a result of this whole value chain interventions, has actually grown from a 10 million rands industry to more than 100 million rands in the industry, with job creation in the whole process. But key to its success, besides it being a whole value chain approach, is the fact that, which is what Omri indicated earlier, is the fact that integrated into this whole new revitalization of the cotton industry is a traceability system, which provides quality assurance and tracing and quality assurance and standards for the product throughout the value chain, and actually tracks the prices that different parts of the value chain are able to capture, and the value that all the different parts of the value chain need to be able to capture. We shouldn't forget that if we were to put together a similar kind of approach as is now being advocated in the current draft of the Agriculture Master Plan, and we implement that for the mohair industry, we would have a dramatically different impact on the economy, particularly because 90% of the mohair that is produced in the country is actually exported. So why not actually move towards investments into the infrastructure and throughout the whole value chain of the mohair industry, including the appropriate road infrastructure and networks for those particular smallholder farmers, because the majority now of producers of mohair are actually smallholder farmers in rural areas. This could provide sustainable jobs for them because they would have very good enterprises, but also it will add more value by creating other jobs in the value chain, which you actually could change the economy of some of our rural towns. So it's these types of interventions that, in my view, fit very well within the district development model. Thank you.
All right. There is first a statement and then a question by Jermaine Charnley. Maybe the statement, I'll put it forward to you, Wandile and Omri as well. Jermaine starts by saying protected market segments make it near impossible for Black businesses to penetrate. So he's raising an issue of protected market segments. Maybe if you can speak to that, Wandile and Omri. And then a question for the minister. What intervention is government making to ensure that its efforts are not flouted through commercial markets being protected through non-competitive behavior by large established commercial businesses? If we can then start with Wandile and then Omri and then have the minister answer the question.
Thanks, Phumelela, and thanks for the question. But I would put a different take on it. I don't necessarily believe that South Africa has strictly protected market segments per se. But what I would say is certain players have grown to have a much more bigger muscle and be dominant in certain value chains, whereby then the small players find it hard to participate onto that. And I do think that the theme of the sessions that we are talking about today on infrastructure in agriculture, the investments that Dr. Mahlati and many other speakers have already alluded to, they are still a hindrance to that participation. If you are having someone participating in a smallholder farm somewhere in a remote area and they're facing higher transaction costs on getting that product in a still fresh way into the market, that is not necessarily the protected of a segment, but rather whereby all of these infrastructure constraints actually eliminate them from actually participating in a value chain. So I think that our private sector and the government efforts should really entail on working towards this. But to a certain extent, though, as I close on this point, the point that the minister made also on her opening remarks, where she refers to the remodeling of the agri-parks, it does provide to a certain extent also the opening of the market opportunities for smallholder farmers. But another important point here is to saying, is there a possibility for the government to open certain depots across the country which would procure from smallholder farmers and use that produce either for feeding scheme schools, for certain hospitals in remote areas, for prisons? I think that the solution needs to be looking at a much more wider array on that. And I'm hoping that some of the discussions that the department is having is really looking on that. But certainly from the initial thoughts on reading their document, it does seem that they are looking onto that perspective. So I'll stop there from this point. Thank you.
All right, Omri.
Okay, from my side, I think what is important to acknowledge is that large commercial agriculture is not a trend in South Africa, it's a trend globally. So we don't have a subsidized sector here. So remember, the average profits, depending on what you farm with, range between 5 and 10%, which is, you know, fairly low in terms of profit margins. It depends on what you do. I mean, if it was my plan, I would definitely start with the high-value export crops like macadamia nuts and citrus, etc., and then make sure that we draw in the right. I think we also mentioned it. Draw in the right empowerment or black farmers that can actually help develop those institutions. We've done it with macadamia nuts here and there, and we've done it with citrus here and there. But there is still a massive opportunity to do that. People in rural areas, and you know, whether it's a smallholder farmer or a commercial farmer, they're all the cost of infrastructure is something that affects all of them. And that is why the strategy should be where we have nodes of excellence like Imansdorp Koöperasie or GWK or BKB, where we have those guys that already have the value chains, they're already exporting wool to China, for example. You know, we need to pump more money into that, development money into those you know, commodities. So we almost need to look at the specific commodities that we want to finance. Something like livestock improvement and you know, genetic improvement and export is a low-hanging fruit for us in this country. One of the speakers mentioned the traceability system, and that is something that I think is a low-hanging fruit. So there's definitely great things that we can do in a short space of time, but I come back to the whole capital thing. I know I sound like a record that got stuck, but without cheap capital, all of this is just going to be plans and talks, etc. So, Minister, the suggestion is let's give us half of the money of the agri parks and let's put that in a development fund and fire up these opportunities.
All right, Minister, if you can answer the question from Jermaine Chandley.
It was just a cheeky question, but.
No, Omri, I was actually going to say you wish. But anyway, those are some of the matters we need to engage to. Firstly, I must say that the department and as a whole of government, we work together with the Competition Commission, particularly to deal with issues of malpractices and, you know, the issues of concentration and protectionism. But I think in the agricultural sector, there are issues that we must confront, in my view, which I think the agricultural sector plan will enable us to deal with head-on, because some of the issues are not as stark as one would say so. You'd recall that in the past, there were marketing boards. And in 1996, when those marketing boards were actually done away with, converted into trust, and you know, you have got trust that has got some resources that they spend, but the question we need to ask ourselves, to what extent are those resources shared with the new entrants? I don't think we've done enough, even with those resources, in my view, to ensure that we open up. If you look at some of the industries in the agricultural sector, I think some of the barriers relate to what we set up as standards that then exclude. I mean, if we were to talk on poultry, for instance, it's a well-known case. It's an issue that I raised even with the poultry industry, that if you look at the specification of what a chicken house must look like, it's so expensive than the chicken inside. And those barriers, create a challenge for your small players who may actually have the skill of producing a chicken. But in order for them to be part of your, established commercial sector, they have to fit into this mainstream, if one were to call it that way. So these are some of the issues that we must deal with that might not seem protectionist because there is no regulatory arrangement around those, but in the way in which it presents itself, it excludes the majority. And I think that's the question that the participant was raising. And for me, having gone through the poultry and the sugar master plan, it was not an easy part because we had to really confront some of the challenges in the practice that are there in that sector that actually exclude the new entrants, which as the two industries, we had to confront about how do we actually transform and create the space for others to participate in this industry. Thank you very much.
All right, thanks, Minister. I believe that we are ready to watch that video of one of the projects that Sydney spoke about earlier on. Maybe let's take a look at that project, at that video, and see what good things have been found there. Seems like all right, it seems like it really is a great project that can actually transform a lot of lives there. I wish we had an audience to give us a round of applause for that. That's one of the projects that have been funded by Sydney Soundy and his. Maybe just to close it off, if we can have 2 minutes each, starting with Dr. Helke Martiens, who can just wrap up with her last words here for us.
So listening to everyone, I think we all have to do a lot of work looking at ways to raise funding, and then also looking at viable projects that really can help, and then also building bridges between small-scale farmers, like Mr. Omri van Zyl said, that if commercial farmers can team up with small-scale farmers or developing farmers, we can really create a more sustainable future and more higher success rate. So I'm really excited to look for ways to find those solutions for agriculture.
Dr. Vuyo Mahlati, your last words, ma'am. All right, maybe perhaps Dr. Mahlati, if you can unmute yourself, if you have muted yourself.
I think he's still in the line.
Sorry?
I think she has left the call after she made her last comment.
All right, Dr. Mahlati has left the call. Then maybe Dr. Shadrack Amwepoli there.
Yeah, thank you, Chair, and thank you, Minister, for a very good, insightful comments in this particular interaction. I think the seeds, as indicated by earlier comments, is beginning to provide an appropriate platform into which we could begin to explore the nature of infrastructure investments, which we believe need to be linked with appropriate skills for production and productivity. But some of these investments in terms of infrastructure needs to enable science and technology development in order for that particular science and technology development to serve as a vehicle or an enabling environment to increase production and productivity, and to enable a number of these particular enterprises to be innovative, but also besides being innovative, to be sustainable and profitable. We need to keep in mind at the back of whatever we're doing that we're living in a world in which we need to be responsive to climate change. And therefore, investments that also look at enabling agriculture and agro-processing's capabilities towards resilience to climate change is going to be key, such as looking at projects that are investing into renewable energy infrastructure, particularly for our smallholder farmer production, even for the large-scale commercial production. We need to also be looking at the fact that we're a water-scarce country, so water use efficient irrigation systems is going to be critical, and circulatory water systems are also going to be important in terms of those kinds of investment. We need to look forward to enabling traceability systems in most of our production systems, but also we need to find a way in which we identify these particular projects and we work as in partnership, both in the government sector, but also in the private sector, towards enabling these particular projects to be successful. We're looking forward to further engagements with a whole range of investors, both in the public sector and through the blended finance models, but also in the private sector to enable agriculture to be successful. Thank you.
All right, your last 2 minutes.
You're talking to me?
Yes, Omri.
Okay. So I think as a starting point, let's create a policy environment that is conducive to investment. That's been one of the biggest challenges, both inward and external investment. We have a very advanced agriculture sector with multinational players bringing their intellectual property to South Africa. We are a first adopter of technology. So by and large, we are the benchmark for commercial agriculture in Africa. I think for us to fire up the rest of the agriculture sector, we need a development finance instrument or a development finance institution. We have the projects that can be multiplied. We have the commodities that are already working with thousands of farmers, emerging farmers. We need to it's not rocket science. We need to be very strategic as to what we invest in, penetrate the offshore markets that will earn capital for the country. The wool industry, the cotton industry are good examples. And then if we do the simple things right, we will be victorious.
All right. Wanda, let's go for your last 2 minutes, sir.
All right. Thanks again, Pumelele, for this session. I think for me, in addition to some of the points that perhaps maybe Omri touched on, the first point that I think we need to look at is around, which is not directly on infrastructure, but is an inhibiting factor to development in South Africa's agriculture in general, which is on the land governance and the policy side, secure tenure or long-term tradable leases, which I'm sure the department is thinking some of those aspects in a different aspect. So I do think that needs to be there, because it is a prerequisite for any capital flow in the sector. And I think then once that is there will be room for private sector to play part in other infrastructure such as irrigation, your silos, electricity, pack houses, and all of those things. And I think that can play a part. And in other thing that I'm coming up with on these discussions is that the PPP approach seems to be the dominant view amongst all of us that are in this discussion. And I think if we can enter that, whereby there is partnerships from the start, identification of the constraints to growth and inclusiveness in agriculture, designing of the solution together, both parties in the same room, project management and execution also done hand in hand. I think that will assist, and I think that the minister's a master plan, which is already on the table, it is a conduit at which can be used in doing that. Yeah. And I think the two closing points I would make is that on a development finance story, Minister, you don't need to think further on this. I think on your report on a land reform and advisory panel, which was done to the presidency, there is an idea there. That land reform fund idea can work on structuring something that can either be housed at the land bank or anywhere else, which can fill that vacuum. And obviously it would work hand in hand with the blended finance approach, which I'm delighted when you are saying you want private sector to participate on that. I'll stop there.
All right. Sydney Sound, I believe one of the projects that you found there. If you just take a minute to tell us a bit about that, your closing remarks, Sydney Sounding.
Yeah, so I think it's simple for me. There needs to be a directed approach to infrastructure investments, which addresses inclusivity, as well as leverage unutilized land. And indeed, we need to ensure that there's sufficient support from a preparatory point of view. So preparatory before the investment is made in terms of getting the right projects in place. And indeed, in terms of financing, let's look at affordable financing rather than free money. So to the extent to which the development institutions like Land Bank's funding model is appropriately attended to, that should address such. And lastly, in terms of post-finance support, both in terms of execution of the technical nature of projects, but also to support projects for success. Those would be my closing remarks.
All right, sure. Thank you very much. And for the closing remarks fully now, if we can get those from Minister Togotitiza.
Thank you very much, Spumelele, for your facilitation of this roundtable, which in my view was very important to raise very critical issues about how we can ensure that agriculture contributes to our economy, not only to the economy, but also to the food security of the country and also on job creation. I would like to say that for me, this is a starting point. The conversation must continue to ensure that indeed we look at the areas that we have touched on here. How can we ensure that the way in which we support agriculture as government is actually aligned provincially as well as in the municipality, but at the same time, how do we work as an ecosystem between private sector as well as government and the producers to make sure that whatever we do is for the benefit of our country. But what is important also is being able to face the difficult issues in the system, but also some of the legacy issues which we can't run away from as a country. And I think one of the things Dr. Mahlati said earlier is how do we also position ourselves to the global environment, which may be increasingly, difficult given that everybody is trying to develop themselves given the disruption of COVID. So we might have to find that from an export point of view, there may be some glitches, particularly with our old trading partners. They would also be looking for markets, trying to protect their economies. So there are some issues that will face us as a country. Doesn't matter whether we are small or big, we'll need to have a common view on how we deal with it. Some of the issues that came out from this platform, it's how do we as a government communicate in a manner that is accessible to our citizens, and particularly those who are interested in entering the sector, women and young people in particular. How do we package our support in a manner that it can be easily accessible? The issue of financing came out several times, affordable financing to ensure that there is credit available for those who are producers and agribusiness industry. And Wandile is still arguing for the land development fund. I would actually say Wandile, maybe let's say land and agricultural development fund, because those will go together in my view. I agree it's a matter we need to canvass. And maybe it could be a fund that we can position it for private sector participation so that it's not just seen as only government who's expected to come up with that development finance, but it's how do we syndicate, other resources that are there. Interestingly, the issue that was raised by Adesina, from the CEO, the chairperson rather, of the Agricultural African Development Bank rather. In my view, we don't need to lose that because of the interest that AFDB has in agricultural development. And I think as a country, we need to really look at how we also get, to engage with that multilateral institution in our continent for agricultural infrastructure and agricultural development in general. Also with the Land Bank, with the World Bank rather, there are issues that they've raised and their interest on infrastructure. And I'm sure with agricultural infrastructure, we've been working with them as part of the AU Special Technical Committee on Agriculture to look at how we revitalize agriculture's African agriculture, during this period and post-COVID. So there are other players, in my view, that we need to actually ensure that we engage with as we go forward and not only look internally in our country. Thank you very much. And thanks to all the participants and to you, Spumelele, for really steering this ship very well. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much, Minister of Agriculture, the Honorable Sowatitiza, and Joylene van Wyk. We see your tweets as well. Thanks for watching and for tuning in. Lloyd Phillips, you also see your tweets. Also, thank you very much for tuning in. And I guess we have come to the end of our session. A few glitches and all, a few forgetting the microphone a few times, but we will get used to this, and hopefully solutions that have been put forward here will be taken forward in a post-COVID world to help the agricultural sector here in South Africa and to possibly enter new markets as well in a post-COVID world. Thank you very much.
Thank you, colleagues.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.